For the next 40 minutes, we will turn our focus to the future of innovation and collaboration in a hybrid work environment, including how to pursue business growth through a crisis and strategies for workplace leaders on managing for results as opposed to attendance. Let's welcome on our panelists for our first roundtable, Strategies on Maintaining Innovation and Collaboration. I'd like to first welcome Jason Brommet. Jason is the head of modern work at Microsoft in Mississauga, Ontario. Next, I'd like to welcome Kathy Parker. Kathy is a consulting partner and the leader of PwC's Workforce of the Future practice in Toronto. And Robert Hosking will round out our discussion. Robert is Senior Vice President and Managing Director of Search Practices at LHH Knightsbridge in Toronto. Welcome, Jason, Kathy, and Robert, and thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Marcel. Excited to join everybody.
So let's jump in. As we have all experienced, the COVID-19 pandemic has turned the lives of office workers upside down, with many continuing to work from home 1 year later. Looking into the crystal ball, what do you see as the most likely path forward for business? Jason, we'll start with you.
Sure thing, Marcel. Thanks for the opening slot. Listen, at the end of the day, the pandemic has really shown that when employees are equipped with the right technology and support from management to remain productive, engaged, and connected, it's truly amazing to see what they're capable of. One of the things for us, as we've been able to watch our signals and listen and learn from our customers, is irrespective of people watching, our people are still getting work done. Without question, and we just released some amazing statistics in our annual work trend index that I believe we're going to post into the river for everyone. We truly do believe that the future is one that will be hybrid, which will be this balance of extreme flexibility and hybrid work, which really will define the post-pandemic workforce.
Thanks, Jason. What about you, Kathy? What do you see as the most likely path forward for businesses?
I have to agree with Jason, Marcel. It clearly seems like a hybrid model for working is really here to stay. Although I do have to acknowledge that that is, more the exclusive purview of those who are lucky enough to work in office. And so we do have to be conscious of that. But certainly a recent survey that we had as well, employees told us, and it was a global employee survey, they told us that they want a mix of virtual and face-to-face working. So I like what Dave mentioned earlier too, and I think it was an important thing to pick up on, and that is that the notion that people want to personalize their work requirements. I think that's also a very important aspect of this whole trend of hybrid working as we move forward. But I think the other important thing too that I'll just raise quickly is the notion of focusing on wellness of our employees, particularly as we continue with a hybrid work model.
Thanks, Kathy. And what about you, Robert?
I would definitely agree as it relates to the hybrid work model, and I think that's really evolved. Even that way of thinking has evolved over the last year. Early on, starting with the thinking that maybe everybody would be remote long term, or certainly well into the future, and that's definitely changing. And I would certainly say that the way that we use or work within the office space will certainly change, and office will likely be very important still. So that physical space, but it's the more collaborative approach, or having spaces that are designed more around groups getting together versus having a separate office or individual spaces where people may have worked in the past. And I think that as we think about culture and how important culture is, and being able to maintain that within that work environment. It's much more difficult to maintain work culture when everybody continues to be remote and maybe don't feel as connected back to that. And I would say that when you think about business travel, one of the things that has come up recently is this conversation around will people want to travel for business? Will organizations want people to travel to go to meetings, and maybe they don't feel that that's necessary? And we recently conducted a poll at LHH where we found that 42% of the respondents indicated that they miss work travel and that interaction with people. So there is a craving and a desire to continue to get together and work together and socialize together.
Excellent. Thank you to each of you for your opening comments here. At this point, we also want to get a sense of where our audience sees the future of their particular workforces ending up, and we'd like to launch a poll, which we'll try to leave up for 15 to 20 seconds. So here we have the question, which model do you see your workplace adopting post-pandemic? 100% remote, no more physical offices, hybrid, a mix of office work and work from home, full return to work or a return to the status quo, and others, something brilliant not yet being talked about. We'll give you each an opportunity to vote here. So here are the results. Overwhelmingly, our audience has voted hybrid, and that confirms some of our earlier polling as well, that the future of work is indeed hybrid. So let's get back to our discussion and see how this may work out. Let's move into one of the issues of the future workplace, which is finding the right mix for collaboration and innovation in a hybrid work environment. To this point, what solutions have proven most popular in helping employers solve issues around innovation and collaboration? And how can leaders leverage these solutions to improve performance? Kathy, I'll throw this one to you.
Great, thanks, Marcel. Obviously, we all know that technology has been incredibly important in facilitating this move. And, clearly, I know with my clients, many of them, as Jason said, have, been really incredible. And they've probably in many respects surprised themselves even as to how quickly they were able to pivot. So technology obviously is going to continue to be important in terms of the collaboration effort. And there's a variety of tools, and there's lots of really good tools, of course, too. I know personally in PwC, we use things called Mural. We use virtual chats. Video conferencing is just the way things are done now. But I think the notion of technology, while important, it goes beyond that. The ways that we are going to successfully collaborate with people really depends too on people having connection, people having trust, people being able to feel part of something. It's really hard to feel as though you can actually work collectively and collaboratively with someone if you don't feel included in that environment. So this is where we get to those things that are a little less tangible, and the importance of culture in actually laying that sort of bedrock for people to continue to collaborate effectively together. And a lot of that too also goes back to employers and what employers are doing to facilitate that culture, but also too as a focus on their own employees. Are we providing them with work that has purpose? And are we focused in on their wellness? All of these things help that cultural bedrock and facilitate making collaboration and consequently innovation a lot easier.
Thanks, Kathy. What about you, Jason?
So obviously, Marcel, I've got a bit of an orientation on answering this question, but maybe just building on Kathy's point of view. Clearly, I'll say from a Microsoft perspective, tools and technologies like Microsoft Teams and Microsoft 365 have played a profound role. And in many ways, we consider ourselves fortunate, which was with the thrust, I'll say, into this big experiment that we've been in globally, was really a role that we were asked to play by most of our customers to be digital first responders, which was help me empower my organization to continue to operate and survive, let alone thrive and sort of become resiliency, which is really sort of the transition that we've seen as we've moved through, I'll say, the last 12 months of this. Kathy touched on a number of other components of it. We often like to think about this as people, process, and technology, because technology alone cannot solve all of the problems. They become platforms of empowerment, platforms of engagement, but they can be pretty profound. And some of the work that we've done, obviously within Teams itself, but as we look forward, we've got some really exciting technology that we've announced called Microsoft Viva, which is really about this idea of an employee experience platform, which is creating sort of these unifying experiences and systems of engagement for employees. And it's pretty amazing when you think about what technology can do and the ability to read signals and understand how people are working, and then being able to augment it with insights and more qualitative data to say, hey, how are they feeling as they do that work? But being able to understand patterns and practices of how people are working. And so that is as much about, hey, are people getting up early and seeing a lot of email and communication outside of traditional hours that may be indicative of something going on in an organization? Being able to look at people analytics to understand organizational cohesion, that to Kathy's comments, this idea of inclusion's just become profoundly important for a whole bunch of different reasons. But technology can be such a great enabler for that, for leaders to understand, hey, do I have parts of my organization that are feeling feeling more isolated than any other part of my organization. And again, bringing those insights to life, and in some cases, pushing those insights right to what I'll call the edges of the organization, to the people that can actually act on it the fastest. And that's been one of the profound challenges many organizations have struggled with for a huge number of years. But it's also this idea that says technology in many ways can be fun, and this idea of sort of amplifying human ingenuity, which is the mirroring of tools and technologies like artificial intelligence with the capabilities that we as people and humans have in this. And it's the part of my job that I love the most, which is, yes, we're a technology company, but I get the joy of talking about the people implications of it, which is in many ways, how do we enable information and people and resources to find yourself versus you having to go find it. So this idea of empowerment becomes a really important one. Alongside of that is skilling. And we're spending a lot of time, and as a company, investing deeply in how we think about skilling and reskilling the global workforce in a whole host of categories, and really bringing that to life, I'll say, in those systems of record that people choose to work in no matter where they are. And so obviously very technology based, but it is about process and culture, the notion of inclusion, and simple activities like turning closed captioning on in video conferencing platforms so that people that may have a physical disability or may be temporarily impaired and unable to listen, this idea of designing for one but being scalable for so many has also been a real sort of enlightening moment for us as an organization as we've sort of traveled the last 12 months.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah. And Robert, I want to give you a chance to any solutions that you've seen proven effective in terms of innovation and collaboration.
Yeah, thanks, Marcel. I would say a couple of additional items, and particularly as it relates to our business, we've seen a real sharp increase in the need for on-demand services. So services such as coaching for all levels of leaders within an organization, as well as on-demand leadership training and development, available when people need it, how they need it, and it's delivered differently today than it's been. But the change in pace of business has been so significant over the last while that this demand is really there, and many people wondering what that next piece will look like, and hope for some support to be able to get there. I'd also say that we certainly have seen an increase in organizations focusing in on the mandatory town halls, monthly leadership-driven meetings, the open forum discussions for feedback, presidents with drop-in times, because it is that connectivity that the employee is really looking for, and that integration into the organization with that leadership team as well, and certainly an increased use of the surveys, so employment surveys or employee surveys that are in real time, a higher level of frequency around those. Maybe they move from once a year or once every 6 months to once every couple of months, with a real time ability for leaders to be able to respond to what employees are saying and what their concerns are, and address those in real time as well. And that's certainly something that we're seeing that's working quite well.
Yeah, excellent points. Robert, I'm going to come right back to you here for this next question. And that is, when it comes to managing for results rather than attendance, what strategies would you advise in terms of finding the right formula?
Yeah, so when we think about key capabilities of transformational leaders, one that really stands out is trust, and leaders need to possess the ability to trust that their team is actually performing. They're performing the tasks, they're meeting deadlines, they're striving to do the best they can, and achieving those results. And this approach is something that's likely pretty different than maybe when everybody was back in the office, a more traditional work environment where leaders could actually see what was happening throughout the course of the day, engaging directly with people and managing those metrics as well. It's also more difficult in a remote environment for leaders to gain that transparency around that. So I think starting with driving change by really communicating those expectations and outcomes, laying out the potential roadblocks, laying out what those obstacles are, and so that they can account for the time that it might take to move through those. I think one of the big challenges has been observed that things take longer to get done in a remote world, because everybody is weighing in through whether it's email or whether it's through video conference, versus being able to knock on the door and ask a question and have something resolved, or jump in a room and get something taken care of. allowing flexibility for people to work the way that they work best, and that elimination almost of the 9 to 5 workday, where many people do their best work early in the morning or late in the day and take time throughout the course of the day, and allowing freedom and flexibility to be able to do that, providing that the results are there. But we're often seeing that productivity actually has increased as a result of those modified work ways of work. And then I know it's been mentioned, but I think certainly the challenge around personal life balance and making sure that people are taking their time away from the office, not only encouraging it as a leader, but modeling it as a leader. So doing that yourself and making sure that you're disconnecting and your team is disconnecting and feel that they can. Living in this world where everything seems all the time coming at people, it's difficult to be able to navigate. And so really modeling that and encouraging that break so people can be their best.
Kathy, do you want to comment on that? Any strategies you might advise?
Yeah, thanks, Marcel. Maybe just a couple of things quickly, because Robert said a number of very important things in terms of this whole approach of actually having them manage remotely that way. And that's one of the things that we see too, and this maybe goes back to what Jason was talking about earlier in terms of upskilling. This is not, routine for a lot of managers. Traditional model has been, I see you, I can understand what you're doing much more readily. So this is really about a new set of skills in a lot of ways for managers to use. And so, a lot of our focus and a lot of the conversations that we've been having are about instituting coaching models, coaching differently, but also instituting models that help to coach managers to manage their way through this as well too. So again, this is really about how do we support managers? How do we work with them to actually create a new set of routines, because doing this also really requires a new set of routines and a new set of processes. So, getting used to doing things like remote stand-up meetings, if you will, or, instituting other sorts of routines like redesign performance processes and things like that. So this is really about how do we now fit to the world that is different around us, and how do we support managers in the process of executing against that. And one last thing that I would say is change management, and Robert mentioned it. It really is about resetting expectations and really helping others to figure out this is the way we're going now, and supporting them through that process as managers and employees.
Thanks, Kathy. And Jason, I'm sure you have an interesting perspective on this. I'd love to hear a quick comment from you too.
Yeah, sure. So I think Robert and Kathy have hit on some of the obvious. And so if I maybe first pivot on people, which is the idea, I think Robert hit on it first, which is trust and transparency are foundational in terms of those transformational leadership qualities, as we all live in sort of this moment of ambiguity, frankly. And for those that are in Ontario, I was surprised on a call with our worldwide peers when the stay-at-home order came across my emergency beacon on my phone and showed it to the worldwide folks. And so it's kind of been interesting just to sort of share experiences around the board. One of the big pieces in this, and again, there's a human aspect to it, I'll call it, there's a process piece to it, but technology can be a great enabler as well, which is this idea of over communication. A lot of conversations with customers, and it's sort of this, hey, how do we wrestle with sort of transparency and trust in the context of communication, and what do we communicate and how do we do it in a world where our employees are highly distributed? And I think Kathy touched on the comment, which is, yes, knowledge type workers, or knowledge workers as we traditionally know them, in most cases have had the opportunity to be remote. As we think about what we refer to as frontline workers, in many cases they have not, and they've really emerged in many ways as the heroes through this pandemic. How we keep them engaged and participants in the culture becomes really important. There's a big piece of this for us, and talking a little bit about Microsoft, which is as a leadership community, we play an important role. Robert touched on this, which is model the way. You can't sit there on a pedestal and bestow all of these sort of great beliefs and not model those yourself. And in many cases, the data that we have also studied ourselves is managers are bearing a huge portion of the brunt of the pressure that's been imposed as a function of the pandemic. And so taking care of those managers, particularly at the front line, become really important. But it's also this idea of self-empowerment, and how do you actually empower people with tools and technology and insights to help them shape how they spend their time. In certain things, it is cultural, which is, and I often joke with my team and those that I work with, they know, generally speaking, about time that we finish this actually today, about 2:30 to 3 o'clock is my afternoon walk. I get up and religiously 45 minutes, I'm out walking the dog. Part of that's just my mental break. But it's also the dog's practical time to get outside. But it's also about tools like we've got my analytics and insights that are exposed again a little bit to my earlier comments, which is AI-powered intelligence to enable you to understand the way that you're working, be able to block off and protect time. And we're thinking about that more and more in this idea of nudges, which is how do we encourage people through the course of their day to create that space for mental breaks, and partnering with companies like Headspace so that you almost bring meditation directly into the flow of work, into the tools that people are using. But also looking at things like virtual commute. Speaking for myself, I had a 45-minute commute to the office and a 45-minute commute home. It was my natural transition points of my day, personal to professional in the morning and then professional to personal at the end of the day. My ability to sort of process my notes on what did I commit to, what do I need to get through. We're actually digitizing that experience and using technology and AI to nudge people to create that natural transition between work and life, because those lines have blurred. And again, part of this is ultimately that sort of ultimate flexibility that we want people to have to choose how they work. And obviously the culture of their organizations and their employees need to create that space for them.
Yeah, great stuff so far, guys. I've really appreciated hearing from each of you. I want to shift a little bit now to talking about pursuing growth amid a crisis. And Jason, I'll return to you with this question. But in terms of lessons learned as a result of COVID-19, how can leaders and teams drive change and profit from ongoing disruption? Can you comment on that?
Sure. There's maybe three broad categories that I'll touch on. So first, which is this notion of creating a plan to empower people for extreme flexibility, and we've kind of talked through the panel on a number of different patterns and practices that can be employed inside organizations, and the balance of the individual versus the organization, and the culture and leadership attributes that are going to be required to make that true. The second is this notion of investing in both space and technology to bridge the physical and the digital worlds. Again, some shared thoughts already in terms of when we do go back into a workplace environment, the physical redesign of those spaces for optimizing around collaboration, which is in many ways that social equity that we are missing in this highly digital world. But again, is the ability to walk in and out of that physical and digital world is going to become super important. And this idea that says those that are remote are no longer second-class citizens in meetings and conversations, that is going to require both technology, but it's also going to all call it sit on practice and in many ways culture, which is those that do have the opportunity, or again in calendars where we may be alternating schedules, it's going to be the onus is on all of us to make sure that we are being as inclusive as possible. Again, technology can only do not so much to bridge those divides, and so we really need to get into the human side of it. And then the last, which is really this idea of rethinking the employee experience to compete for the best and most diverse talent. I think the talent wars that we know and the skill shortages that we have in this country across so many disciplines and domains, this notion of skilling becomes critically important. But what's emerging as well in the data, and we've touched a little bit on it, is we will see more and more employees looking at workplace strategies and decisions as the factors upon which they decide to move to an employer or to leave or stay at an employer. And so this idea of both attracting and retaining talent are foundational, but it also opens up, I'll say in many ways, borders that may not have been. For the first time ever, and I'll say a many number of years at Microsoft, I have my first two employees that are not physically sitting in our headquarters, and they were both recruited, hired, onboarded, and fully functional through the course of 12 months. I've never met them. And it's fascinating to me as a leader, as just a personal reflection moment, which is why did it take a pandemic for that to be true? And I think it's just now really inspiring me to think different about my personal recruiting philosophies and those that I empower inside my teams. And so those would be sort of three broad categories.
Thanks, Jason. And yeah, before I segue this over to Robert, who I think can build upon what you've shared, I just want to remind the audience that if you do have a question, in a few minutes, we will move into a live Q&A, just to remind you to plunk that into the Q&A tab. But Robert, yeah, can you build upon what Jason shared?
Absolutely, thanks. And Jason spoke about the war on talent or the war for talent, and as it relates to employee retention. And certainly, there's been a big shift. It's interesting, sort of through the early stages of COVID, people really hunkered down in many cases within their current employer situation because they were happy to have a job. They were uncertain about what things might look like in the future, a little resistant to change, and we saw a big shift in that. Certainly through the fourth quarter and into this year, where more and more people are now bringing their heads up a little bit and looking at new opportunities and organizations that may be trying to persuade them to join them. Unemployment numbers have certainly gone down in Canada over the last while. Demand has certainly gone up, and we're already seeing many organizations lose top talent where they didn't necessarily want to, because they're leaving to go to those organizations that they feel either more aligned with from a values perspective, which is very important to them. And many people are looking at the critical nature of not only the work, but the environment that they'll be going to. And so a real, I think, challenge this year for employers will be employee retention, and what are some of the strategies that can be put into play to ensure that you're retaining your top talent, incentives or other things that may be important to them. And that leans into flexibility in the way that people are ultimately working. So I think challenging assumptions on what has maybe worked in the past. Does it still work today? Just because it worked in the past doesn't mean it'll necessarily work in the future. And I think taking the time to step back and really look at some of those things and break them apart will help to build that forward strategy, because business has changed and so many organizations are working to stay not only ahead of the competition, but to stay viable in business based on what's coming down the line. So I think a lot of changes, but things that can be done proactively to really help manage through those.
Thanks, Robert. And yeah, maybe I'll let Kathy close off this portion of the roundtable, and then we do have some questions pouring in from the audience, so I'd like to move to those after that.
Sure, thanks, Marcel. I'll just quickly add that, again, I think consistent with what Jason said, consistent with what Robert said, this is really about employee experience. It's about being very deliberate about understanding what the elements of experience are that you have to create to make sure that you're adapting appropriately to the hybrid environment that will be part of your work reality at your organization. And there's a number of elements to that really for us. It's about, I think, Jason mentioned it, dealing with work-life balance. It's about that, again, back to team communication and connectivity. How are we changing how we do that to make sure that we're focused on the right experience? All of that, of course, connects to maintaining morale in your existing staff, but also ensuring that you're creating the right environment, the right culture to attract the people that you want, keep the people that you have. And as part of doing that, it's really, again, gets back to how are you making sure people stay connected, have a sense of community as we obviously continue through this virtual environment that we are now part of.
Thanks, Kathy. At this point, I want to move to a live Q&A. We have about 10 minutes here before our scheduled break. So for our audience, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A tab, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Kathy, I'll direct the first question here to you. And it is, our company bought a new office space in 2020. Are companies using a space model whereby all non-senior staff work at hotel stations, i.e. no one has an assigned desk? Can you comment on that one?
Well, certainly hoteling as a trend, and I can say that PwC had embraced hoteling itself, certainly well before the pandemic. But hoteling as a trend is certainly part of what we're seeing when we talk to clients about how are you reimagining your workspace. But I think the other thing that we're talking to clients about in thinking about hoteling, or however one wants to contemplate their new workspace, is to really consider the kinds of work that's getting done when you're there, to really dictate and shape what does that space need to look like and how do people work in that space. So we talk about, considering the kinds of collaboration that needs to happen and for what purpose. the kinds of communication that needs to happen, and does that need to happen in the office? There's a lot of info sharing, idea sharing, and that can happen remotely, but what are the kinds that need to actually happen live? We talk also too about creating. What kind of creating can happen on an individual basis remotely, so doing research, things like that, but what has to happen in the office? And then things like, we call it committing, which is really about decision making and committing to action. How does that happen remotely? I think a lot of it can certainly, but what needs to happen live? So we would say those influences are really important in figuring out what does that space look like, and is hoteling part of the solution set that becomes the way that you address that. So it's, I think, probably for many here to stay, but we would say that there's a number of considerations in figuring out exactly what it looks like.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great comment, Kathy. Jason, I'll give this next one to you. How can HR promote a culture of change among micromanagers who insist on returning to the office ASAP?
Oh, such a good one. Listen, I'll be a little blunt in some ways, which is it the carrot or is it the stick? Again, I think there's some pieces, and there was a question that was posed earlier on that says there are some unique trends, I'll say, that are emerging in all of the data that are some function of seniority in the organization, relative career stage, and I'll say in many ways gender. Without question, one is, I think Robert had touched on it, which is the leadership principles. And for us at Microsoft, we've got this model that we refer to as model, coach, and care. And it's the leadership principles that every leader in the organization is held accountable to. It is a non-negotiable in our annual performance reviews that we do a check-in on a quarterly basis. And part of that is modeling the way. Obviously, the care is a fairly straightforward one, coaching relatively straightforward as well. But the model is a big piece of this, which is when you have leaders that are not modeling the way, it sets the tone for the rest of the organization, and in many ways gives all leaders or managers permission to operate in that same fashion. And so it does need to start in many ways with, I'll say, the top-down premise of it in terms of what are your leaders setting the tone of, and then how do you build it into what I'll call it your systems of record that says, are you coaching it all the way through your organizations? Do you have a common set of expectations across your leaders? There's obviously the stick component. Again, I think Robert had alluded to this, the idea of pulse surveys or employee sentiment surveys. We have something we call MS Poll. It's the one big annual survey that we do, and then we have Pulse sort of on a very frequent basis. Data becomes an incredibly powerful way to reinforce a message, and I'd alluded to workplace analytics and insights, some of the technologies that we have. Again, another way to understand patterns and practices and behaviors that may not be obvious at the surface level, but when you start to look at the way organizations and teams are working, it exposes insights. For us, obviously, it is depersonalized information, so it's never about isolating a single individual or a single worker. But I, as a leader, have a set of intelligence that I'm able to see inside of my organization that can help me understand patterns and practices, so I can watch for those fringe cases, so be it. But I'm also empowered with that for my team, so that I'm also self-empowered to drive the behaviors that I want to see inside my organization, and then empowered with, I'll say, comparatives. And so that idea, I think, that was mentioned earlier on around benchmarking becomes really powerful, because in many ways, we as humans, we're competitive. We're all dealing with a lot right now, but we are innately competitive and in many ways have this aspiration to learn.
Thanks, Jason. Robert, this one will be for you. With hybrid and work roles, perceived fairness and equity will be a delicate balancing act. What is the key to getting that right from a messaging standpoint? Is that something you can answer?
Sure. I think, and I know this has certainly come up in other parts of the discussion around strong, certainly communication. And I think communication starting early on as far as what is the plan behind the either return to office, what will that look like, who will be involved, who will have an opportunity to weigh in on what that might look like as well. And I think including or being more inclusive in those conversations will be really important, because there will be mixes of people, some that will really want to come back to the office and be there much more frequently, and others that will say, I would really prefer not to, and if I'm there 1 or 2 days a week, that's fine, maybe not at all. And as organizations work through that, that will help to determine what that office will shape out to be. And I do think having those kind of open conversations, that open dialogue from the top down will be really important as that takes place. And hopefully that will then really help to design or build what the outcome will be of that.
Robert, I feel like this next question is kind of in your wheelhouse, so I'll ask it to you again. How can you as a leader showcase your culture in a virtual world to attract top talent? Like they're saying values and missions on the website is great, but how do people know for sure what people in the organization stand for?
It's a great question.
Glad you got that one first.
Yeah, thanks. Well, and it is really tough. You know, it's because culture is something that's often defined with people working with collaboratively with one another physically, and what they can see and what you can touch within an office environment is or becomes the culture. Hiring somebody in who's never experienced that, they can enter into what feels like a bit of an abyss, where, you know, if they don't necessarily know where to go or who to go to or who to talk to, it becomes a little lonely and a little confusing. And so I would certainly say that the build out of that onboarding plan is really critical, number one, and having that well established and well designed before the person ever starts. Onboarding, in my opinion, starts before the person actually starts. So that's having conversations with many of the key stakeholders within the organization, even before they're there, the welcoming of that individual, and then spending time. It's onboarding isn't just one person's responsibility. It's a team play where everybody plays a part in this, and designing that onboarding plan around multiple stakeholders, some of whom have worked in the organization for long periods of time and have lived that culture from the beginning or certainly early stages, others who are newer to the organization and how did they get into it, so that those conversations can really help to shape or frame what the culture is all about. And we're hearing some really good stories out there in terms of organizations that have done a good job of this, and embedding people very quickly or inserting people very quickly into those conversations, keeping people well connected, providing them with a mentor early on, somebody who exudes that culture and really lives it and believes it, introducing them into other parts of the organization as well, so they feel very inclusive. And I think that's really key to being able to do that. And again, you know, I can't speak enough about communication, how important it is to drive strong communication right from the top all the way through, and ensure missions and values and goals are really well established, really well set out, and everybody feels part of that.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, we are at time, unfortunately. So I really just want to say thank you for this conversation. It's been very enlightening. We're going to move into our break for 10 minutes before we come back to our second roundtable. And so again, thank each of you.